Yo, real quick, before we start the video, I would just like to say that I have a Discord. Um, you guys should probably join mainly because of the fact that there's a bunch of ideas there that are just waiting to be tested out. You guys can see a bunch of thumbnails I have for different series, some that are already out and some that are just in the woodworks for right now. You guys will probably be interested to join the Discord, be also able to share some of your ideas with others just in case if I don't personally seem to like some of them. But majority I do like them, just some are kind of too how should I say it? I just don't know how to really make a good story out of some of them, although they do seem interesting. So basically just join the Discord and that's pretty much all. I will leave a link to the Discord in the description below. Yeah.
In the whipping, I'm whipping the soul out it. Chin the tone when I'm flexing like Pilates. Why you frontin', you act like you somebody. Keep a trail in the ville, how I go by. I was stuck in the rut, I was nobody. I've been looking for something to go body. There's an art to the hustle like yo got it. Kick out a kick back and hit like a new shotty. In the whipping, I'm whipping the soul out it. Chin the tone when I'm
Tatsumi was a fighter. That's something everyone knew. He had a pretty strong will despite all the times people tried to stomp on his dreams. He and his friends came from a rather poor village. The village leaders were incapable of providing much for the young ones. Food was lacking in their small village. They had to teach them how to survive on their own from an early age. Tatsumi was taught how to wield a sword by one of the retired veterans within their village. In case he ever did lose his sword though, he was also taught the art of hand-to-hand combat alongside blacksmithing. Tatsumi had a plan. He and his friends would join the kingdom's army, and over the years, they would rise in the ranks. He'd be able to give back to those who took the time to actually teach him how to survive on his own and give a more prosperous future to his small village. By the time the trio were teenagers, they packed their bags and started their journey. They were going to the capital. Unfortunately, along the way, Tatsumi found himself fighting this weird black creature with 8 legs. He figured that it was probably a danger beast. He wasn't exactly sure what type though. It really wasn't anything that he'd ever seen before. The creature's face was also weird. Several eyes weren't all that weird, but each and every last one of those eyes were pure white. Tatsumi went ahead and began chopping down on the beast's legs, causing it to scream in pain. He didn't stop there though. Tatsumi made sure to stab into what he believed was the monster's forehead. The monster collapsed not even 5 seconds later. He had a little difficulty, but not enough to really call it challenging. Tatsumi began to pant lightly, but he looked over to the people he saved. One of them had already fainted, though. Hey, do any of you guys know where the capital is? Tatsumi asked. Although they were shocked seeing how easily Tatsumi took down the monster, they snapped themselves out of the trance they were in and gave him the coordinates. They were surprised to hear that he wasn't already a soldier in the kingdom's army with the skills he had, but they figured Tatsumi had a good chance at joining their army. Well, with the right connections, or if he really stood out. They wished Tatsumi the best before the boy made his way to the capital. What Tatsumi didn't realize during this time though was the fact that There was some black substance leaking off by the danger beast he killed. The substance attached itself to one of Tatsumi's shoes and practically merged with it as well. He didn't notice any difference though. It was only after he fell on his luck did he realize something odd. The first time he noticed something off about himself was when a blonde girl ended up conning him out of his money. He was angry when he found out that this girl had no connection to the army. She stole all of his savings. Jeez. He was so angry that he banged his fist on the bar's counter, accidentally forming a hole in it. Needless to say, he was immediately kicked out. He was on the streets now with nothing to his name. Oh, wasn't that great? Tatsumi only hoped that his friends were doing better than him at the time. Thankfully, right before it began to rain, a wealthy girl by the name of Arya invited him back to her house to stay for the night. She'd be willing to help him out since he seemed to be down on his luck right now. And she hated seeing people suffering. Tatsumi had a weird vibe about the girl, but figured that things couldn't get any worse than how they were now. He accepted her offer and followed her home. There he ended up finding out about the fact the kingdom was in shambles. Their king was a child and the prime minister was basically using them as a puppet in order to get what he wanted in the long run. There was also a group known for killing civilians by the name of Night Raid. Apparently they went for the wealthy and the girl's family was probably a target themselves. He overheard this from one of the guards of the house. This made Tatsumi kind of nervous, but he figured that since there were people to protect them, he'd be safe. Even if the group arrived, he wouldn't have to worry about them. Right? Right? He was wrong. Very, extremely wrong. The guardians were absolutely no match for these guys. Tatsumi quickly ran to find Arya and inform her of the situation they were in. They need to run far away from here as soon as possible. She was with one of her remaining guards. When he found her, they all ran towards her shed. They were hoping to hide out in here the whole night and hope that the members of Night Raid didn't encounter them. That was a pipe dream though. One of the girls of Night Raid was able to catch up to them and easily dispose of the guard. They screamed in pain as they died from the cut that the black-haired girl of the Night Raid gave them. Tatsumi saw their veins bulge, but as far as he could tell, it was just a small cut the girl gave him. Was that sword she was carrying dipped in poison or something? She also mentioned something about him not being a target. She pretty much just jumped over him at the time and focused on killing the guard. Soon it was going to be this kind girl too. Tatsumi looked over to the cowering Arya and decided to take up his sword against this member of Night Raid. He had to protect her after all. He was her only means of defense left. If no one else saved her, who would?
Allow me, a strange voice stated.
Tatsumi began looking around to see who said that. It couldn't have been from the girl with the sword unless she wasn't human or something. That sounded more like the voice of a demon than anything. A weird sensation crawled up Tatsumi's body at the moment though. He looked down at his hand to see it covered in an inky substance. He was about to squeal in surprise, but it was like the thing knew exactly what he was about to do. His mouth was covered by the substance, and it spread to his face as well. It enveloped his whole body now. Arya wanted to scream in horror seeing this, but the creature turned to her direction and covered her mouth. They signaled for her to shush. They'd handle this mistress. Tatsumi had no control over his body at that moment, but it didn't seem to matter. Whatever was controlling his body at that time seemed to know his desires here. Tatsumi could see the being shape what seemed to be their arm into a blade. They went on to attack their opponent. Akame was surprised to see this new person appear though. They charged at her and immediately went on an onslaught. She struggled to fight this guy considering how much stronger and faster they were than her. She tried cutting him down when she found an opening, but they just created tendrils that grabbed her katana. Her eyes widened as a blade was yanked out of her hands. She couldn't believe it. What kind of tegu did this guy have? The monster that stood before her roared before swinging the sword at her. A new person joined the fray though, snatching Akame up by the hair. The being looked up and saw who would dare disturb his battle. What he saw enraged him even further.
You.
Me, Leone replied. Akame stopped Leone from recklessly running in though. She pointed over to what the being was holding. Leone took a good look at it for a second before her eyes widened. How? She asked. Akame summarized all that happened here so far. She killed a guard and this guy came out, swinging his own blade at her. They were strong and their body was really weird too. She figured it was the doing of a tegu though. There was no other explanation for how they could create tendrils from the side of their body and grab a sword like that. Leone couldn't really make much sense of it either. All she knew was that this guy was bad news. She had to be really careful here. No, actually, it would be better to get some backup. They needed someone with a long-range tegu or something like Bulat, who had a tegu that created armor for him. They weren't given the opportunity to flee though. Tatsumi's rage towards the blonde caused him to take control and begin to swing wildly. Leone dodged the attack though and swamped his legs from underneath him. She quickly grabbed the katana, but the tendrils pulled on the sword as well. She was shocked to see it. Akame wasn't really lying at all when she mentioned how this guy's body was weird. Akame, go get mine or someone. I'll hold him off. Akame was about to say something, but Leone shut her up before she could have the chance. She tussled with the man while Akame fled the scene. It wasn't too long until she found herself at the mercy of the symbiote. They were going to try to stab her with the sword they gained from Akame, but Leone was grabbing onto his arms. She was trying to push him back. The gooey substance covering Tatsumi's face peeled back to reveal himself to Leone. That way his face would be the last thing she'd see before dying. Such was life. Tatsumi was about to kill her, but Leone pleaded for her life. Tatsumi yelled at her, wondering why her life should be spared when she was about to kill a perfectly innocent girl and her family. Leone laughed at the irony here. Innocent, you say? Alright, if she's so innocent, then I'm a saint. This girl and her whole family are known for convincing people to come to her house only to put something in their food and torture them later on. Look behind those doors real quick. If you don't see anything, I won't even struggle. I'll accept my fate. Sounds like a deal? Tatsumi stayed silent. He got up from the compromising position and walked over to see what this thief was talking about. If she was lying, he would make sure her death was as painful as possible. Arya began to beg Tatsumi not to listen to Leone when she saw him reaching closer to the shed. She even grabbed onto his leg in order to pull him back, but it was pointless. He kicked down the metal doors, impressing Leone. She knew this guy had to be strong, but he seemed to do that with no effort. Even she had to put in a little elbow grease in order to get through something like those metal doors. She walked behind Tatsumi, staying a fair distance away though. Tatsumi froze when he looked inside. No. He didn't want to believe this to be true, but he was seeing it with his own eyes now. What is all this? Tatsumi shrieked. Leone sighed and folded her arms. I told you, didn't I? I wouldn't lie about these sort of things. These sick bastards take newcomers entering the capital and torture them to death in order to amuse themselves. Now, with this new information in hand, what are you planning on doing? Leone asked. Tatsumi looked around but stopped when he saw Sayo. They called out for his name, but they were faint. Tatsumi dropped the sword when he heard their voices. Tears began to form in his eyes. They were a mixture of sadness and rage. Arya realized her situation here and gave up trying to hold on to the persona any longer. She revealed their true nature, mentioning how it was unfair that the one with black hair had such soft hair, while her own was always a struggle to manage every day, feeling like hay. That was the last straw in Tatsumi's book. He turned to Arya and punched a hole through her chest before the symbiote covered his head again. They roared and bit off her head. Leone was surprised to see this, but it accomplished their goal either way. For him to kill that girl wasn't a surprise, but that last part made Leone take a step back. Tatsumi turned to Leone, who was a bit nervous now. She couldn't really tell his expression with that mask covering his face, but he seemed hungry. Hey, I've got a proposal for you. Why don't you join us? There are a lot more wicked people out there that need to be dealt with, and you can make a profit off of doing this too. Heck, you can probably feast on some of them too if you want. Please don't kill me, she whispered the last part. Tatsumi didn't really know what to do here. He was lost and he just ate somebody. His heart shattered when he saw Yatsu. He ended up succumbing to the Labora disease. His heart was crushed. The two were so close that he could practically call him a brother. He took his last breath, thanking Tatsumi for avenging him. At least he could rest in peace. Tatsumi dropped down to his knees and began to tear up. His best friends were dead, and he really had no one else now.
False. You have me. We have each other. We have these people extending their hands out to us in order to continue spreading justice across the land. Join the dark side. Become one with the darkness. We've already dipped our toes in it, so we have no choice. Do it! Do it! Do it!
Fine, you win! Tatsumi exclaimed. Leone was confused and raised an eyebrow. I'll join your team. Night Raid is what you guys call it, right? Oh, wonderful. Come with me then. Tatsumi's black suit began to retreat back into wherever it was hiding, and Leone led Tatsumi over to where the rest of her group was. The one wearing the armor, after being explained the situation, immediately changed his tune and grabbed Tatsumi, launching him over his shoulder. Akame quickly went and grabbed his twin before they left the area. By the time they made it to the hideout, Tatsumi finally came back to his senses. He was now beginning to second-guess his decision. He wasn't exactly sure if he wanted to join Night Raid or not. Leone showed him across the place where he ended up meeting other people of Night Raid and realized their more unique personalities. That and, the sexuality of one of the other characters as well, if you get my gist. When he finally met their leader, Agenda, Tatsumi wanted to know what would happen to him if he were to, for whatever reason, refuse to join them. Contrary to his belief, though, Agenda affirmed that they wouldn't kill him or anything. Rather, he would be a laborer. He'd be working for them one way or another and make an income to send back to his village, but if he chose to become a laborer, he wouldn't be allowed to leave the hideout. The voice in his head began whispering about how Tatsumi would join Night Raid. They wouldn't stop until he accepted Agenda's offer of being part of their team. Tatsumi looked up at Agenda with a determined look in his eyes and declared where his loyalty stood. Agenda smiled hearing this. She also heard a couple of things from Leone and Akame about him having a special Taegu of sorts which interested her. One of these days she would have to see it for herself. The symbiote took over Tatsumi's face for a second though, asking about when they would get to eat some brains or chocolate. One or the other was fine in their book as long as they got some. Agenda laughed hearing this, but stated that he could eat as many as he wanted so long as it didn't distract from the mission. This put a smile on the symbiote's face. It didn't take long for Tatsumi to begin to grow ties with a couple of the members of Night Raid. Tatsumi ended up meeting the different members of Night Raid and found that they were an interesting set of characters. The first was Bulat, who he was pretty surprised to find out about since he was a tall, beefy dude. Not only that, but he was also the guy in the armor from last night. If you had to imagine what the person underneath the suit would look like, Bulat was a pretty good representation of what he imagined. Shell seemed like a pretty unusual figure herself, but more because of the fact she was an airhead. It was almost all the time she was staring out into space. Mine seemed like some sort of stuck-up princess, but her Taegu was no joke. He wasn't sure if he could really handle that, even with whatever sort of Taegu he himself had. Agenda was an ominous figure. He couldn't really read much into her. Lubak seemed like a fairly intelligent man, but he was also a pervert. Yeah, that was about it. Akame, she was different. Tatsumi remembered fighting her last night in order to protect what he had originally thought was a good person. He was able to overwhelm her back then, and it seems like Akame had a bit of a bitter response to this. She was pretty distant towards him. She hardly talked, and even when she did, she used pretty simple sentences that would get the point across. She also behaved far less than human. Tatsumi saw how she was so willing to kill, and he understood that part considering the organization they were in, but even when it came to food, this girl came off as extremely weird for the simplest of tasks like peeling potatoes or stirring some chicken in a fire. Tatsumi kept his distance around, although she tried to fluster him on multiple occasions. It was because of her attempts at flustering that made Tatsumi especially want to avoid her, since his hormones seemed to be even stronger than before he encountered this imperial arm. Tatsumi didn't know much about this weapon, but it seemed to be alive and it was affecting his behavior a little. He was a bit on edge while at the hideout. Nagenda wanted Tatsumi to fight Akame one time in order to see where he ranked among the members one day. Sure, she heard about Tatsumi managing to strip her of her weapon, but she wanted to see this for herself. Whether this was a fluke or if Tatsumi could actually overpower her once again. Once the match started and the goo covered Tatsumi, the black-haired girl immediately charged at him. Almost on instinct, Tatsumi shot a web at her legs. She leaped into mid-air though right before the attack could land. Tendrils formed in Tatsumi's arms and he began to throw whips at her while she was still in mid-air. She tried cutting them, but Tatsumi dragged her down to the ground with her sword in one of said tendrils. She just seeing how easily Tatsumi managed to unarm her. Even Agenda was impressed in all honesty. She supposed it wasn't a fluke. He seemed to be a pretty valuable member in the meeting. In the making. Agenda liked this. She turned over to Leone and gave her a thumbs up for finding this kid in the first place. Leone's sweat dropped, considering the circumstances behind her recruiting the brown-haired lad. Even with the defeat of Akame, though, they needed Tatsumi to do one last thing before they could be considered an official Night Raid member, and that was to kill 2 high-up government officials. Since he was new, there would be 2 others going with him in the form of Akame and Leone. Their mission was in the middle of the night. The girls were giving him instructions and a mention of the appearance of these guys. They tried listing out a plan for what to do here, but when they were actually able to get a hold of them, things went a little differently from how they originally thought it would go. Simply put, when Tatsumi found his intended target, he didn't give them the chance to scream or plead. Venom consumed him and a hulking appearance shadowed over the figure. They barely looked humanoid as they grabbed the government official and threw them into their mouth. All that remained of him were their bones and the hand, although several teeth marks could be found on it. He went and found the 2 girls afterwards. They had already put down their assailant by the time he arrived. Tatsumi took a moment to barf, remembering what he did earlier. He couldn't believe he ate a whole human after all. Was this something his Tegu required? He really wasn't hoping so. There had to be an alternative to this so he could avoid the consumption of other humans. On the bright side though, Tatsumi became an official member of Night Raid that night. There was a little inspection done by Akame after the mission though in order to see if he sustained any injuries, and sure enough, there was not even a scratch on Tatsumi. How interesting. Nagenda decided to pair Tatsumi up with mine for his next mission though. A couple of assassins seemed to find the Night Raid hideout one day though. They were easily dealt with by the various members of the assassin group, and Tatsumi's display was especially violent as he began to chew on one of their heads. Many were shocked to see this, but they couldn't focus on it for too long. Instead, they made sure to finish off the rest of the assassins first, and they would probably ask questions later. Tatsumi and mine went on a couple of stakeout missions after that, pretty much just observing the area of the capital. What Tatsumi ended up finding throughout all of this was that the people were actually pretty unhappy, unlike what he had originally managed to conjure up for his belief of what it would be like to live within the capital. He was surprised to find out about just how corrupt their government actually was. He couldn't blame these people at all for being unhappy. There were even people who would abuse their rankings within the society, and they ended up encountering a pair who were messing with a refugee. Tatsumi managed to scare them away by swiping at their pants, causing them to fall down to their ankles. They were in their boxes and they were afraid. They left the refugee to their own devices, since they didn't want to mess with whoever Tatsumi was. That was the most interesting part of their day. Beyond that, it was just Tatsumi and mine buying clothes. Buying clothes for her, that was. He had to hold everything she bought too. What a waste. At least he managed to find out the reason why they were able to roam around in the capital with absolutely no issues though. That being, of course, the fact they didn't have any wanted posters yet, and almost everyone paid attention to the flyers that were hanged across the street in regards to the infamous squadron known as Night Raid. When they made their way back to the base, Tatsumi actually got a mission from an agenda, that mission being to butcher a relative of the Prime Minister and his 5 guards who were using women for pleasure without consent. The guards also partook in such actions, which was why they needed to be dealt with as well. Mine and Tatsumi had no complaints whatsoever with their mission. All they required was a good spot. It was the middle of the night when their mission began to take place. Mine aimed a gun at the entrance of the palace that the Prime Minister was in. As soon as he came out with several women by his side, she aimed a weapon at her target and concentrated before shooting a beam of light at him, piercing through his skull. Tatsumi was impressed. As soon as they noticed the guards begin to scatter, they realized where they were heading. Tatsumi wanted to fight them, but Mine convinced him that it would be best if they at least wait until they made it back to the rest of Night Raid first. Tatsumi had to begrudgingly agree, considering all of the unknown elements if they were to ever try and fight them. Once they made it back to the rest of Night Raid, the knights were almost instantaneously put down. Although they realized it was only 4 instead of 5 guards they managed to put down, the group figured the last one just ran away. That bit them in the back later on though, as it turned out the very last one was actually hiding, waiting to find a moment of weakness within one of the members. Tatsumi was with Mine at the time when he realized that one guard managed to survive. Tatsumi shoved her out of the way and equipped himself with Venom. With an amazing burst of speed, Tatsumi managed to land a fist on the remaining soldier. Well, not on, but more so through the remaining soldier. It was a gory sight, but Tatsumi regretted nothing since it still protected Mine. She was left awestruck seeing this. Tatsumi and Bulat practiced their swordsmanship skills the next day as if nothing happened when Akami requested for Tatsumi to come help her cook. He had no issues with this since he was hoping to get to know the strange girl a bit better over time. She seemed to be genuinely happy that he wasn't injured the first time around, so she couldn't be all that bad, right? Right? She was still an oddball in his book, but she was getting better. Tatsumi also heard about this new target, Zonku, from the agenda, although he knew nothing about this person. The same could be said for Shell in this case. Mine sighed. She could understand Tatsumi, but when it came on to Shell, she figured that they just forgot. Mine explained that Zanku used to be one of the Empire's executioners before going mad from seeing all of the countless deaths. It was rumored that this guy had some sort of Tegu as well. Legenda wanted to have this guy dealt with as soon as possible. She decided to test Tatsumi's capabilities during this mission. Legenda also sent Akame for a safe measure. When they were able to find a man, he appeared to be a bit of a struggle for Akame thanks to the special telekinetic ability of his Tegu, but the same couldn't be said for Tatsumi. Once Venom ramped themselves over Tatsumi's body, it was as if Zanku was attacking a brick wall. His abilities were completely null against whatever this monstrosity was. One punch from Tatsumi was enough to dislodge the man's head from his body. He was surprised at the amount of strength he had in that moment. He held nothing back, sure, but he wasn't expecting for his strength to be to such a degree. Akame saw this as well, and she was pretty surprised to see Tatsumi be capable of such a thing. What could this Tegu not do? She walked over and grabbed the deceased man's Tegu afterwards. She was honestly expecting for this to be a little harder than it actually was. Legenda applauded them on a job well done and went on to send a Tegu to the Revolutionary Army. After all, to her knowledge, everyone had a Tegu to call their own, so there was no need in bothering to try it out on anyone. She didn't want to risk the possible consequences of doing such. Tatsumi had a burning question within his mind though. What was the strongest Tegu of modern times? Legenda froze for a second as she began to go into a deep thinking process. I suppose it depends on what do you mean by strongest. Do you mean practicality, lethal force, or the variety of abilities granted to you by said Tegu? Since you asked though, I'd have to say the Tegu known to grant the user ice manipulation. I don't know much about your Tegu though, Tatsumi. For all we know, it could eventually turn out to be in the top 5 for strongest Tegus, although I doubt it would ever surpass the one I mentioned before. Tatsumi's curiosity rose even more here. Did this Tegu have an owner as of yet, and if so, who? Were they on their side? Legenda almost laughed when she heard Tatsumi ask that last question. She quickly explained that it belonged to the one known as Esdeath, and she was one of, if not the, most feared general within the Empire's army. She was ruthless and managed to take down all who dared to oppose her. Tatsumi began to sweat the more Legenda talked about the woman. She relieved his stress though by going on to further inform Tatsumi of the fact Legenda wasn't even in the capital during the time they spoke. He released a breath he didn't even know he was holding at the time. No Ice Queen, no worries. After all, according to Legenda, she was already on a mission to conquer another kingdom and have them be forced to become subservient to her nation. This was supposed to take a year. That sounded like plenty of time for Tatsumi to become stronger and learn more about his supposed imperial arm. Not only that, but also find an alternative to feasting on brains and his adrenaline whenever he used the symbiote's strength. Night Raid had no idea what would be coming next though. As far as they were concerned, this woman wouldn't be an issue to their plans for the next year. Legenda didn't hesitate to send Tatsumi and Leone to the capital next in order to complete another one of their missions. This time around, it appeared that where the district they were in Leone was a celebrity of the sorts and managed to somehow get herself into trouble along the way too with people she swindled before, of course. That wasn't too much of an issue though, despite getting split up along the way. They were able to find each other and take down some guys who were in the process of ending a girl's life though. And at this moment, Tatsumi was contemplating whether or not he should have just killed them. Death seemed too merciful though, as he was plagued by flashbacks from that night. Leone calmed Tatsumi down by explaining that a doctor could check on the girl's condition and help the best he could if Leone asked him. After all, he kinda owed her a favor anyway. She smiled at Tatsumi though when he calmed down. It seemed like he really did care for others. She admired that even in this profession. She hugged him and went on to bite his neck hard enough for it to begin to bleed, although it healed almost immediately after. This was Leone making Tatsumi as hers. When they arrived back at the hideout though, the atmosphere wasn't as joyous as it once was. It was replaced with a dark, gloomy mist. It was suffocating. Tatsumi looked around before noticing that Shell wasn't there anymore alongside the rest of the group. When he asked about it, mine began to tear up. She was the one to deliver the bad news in this instance. She was forced to witness her demise to someone from the capital. Tatsumi's eyes widened when he heard this. He refused to believe this. He grabbed Mine's shoulders and began to shake her. This had to be a joke, right? Mine screamed in pain and demanded for him to release her. He didn't realize his own strength at that point, and he immediately let go. He wanted to know the face of whoever dared to kill one of his teammates, one of his comrades. Or however you pronounce her name, I don't care, was apparently the person's name, and his eye began to twitch after hearing that name. He met them before, and they were so nice. Then they went on to kill someone he was beginning to grow a bond with. He wanted to get his revenge here and now, but Bulat was the one to hold him back. What Tatsumi was asking to do was absolutely reckless, and that it would be best to help Akami with the cooking for now.
He now had a new desire in mind, and that was to consume that girl. Give into the desires of Venom just this once and kill that bastard in a way that almost mirrored how Shell died.
He trained with Akami for a while, but switched over into training with Bulat. It was almost as if he was releasing all of his pent-up emotions on them every time they trained. He almost never held anything back when sparring against Bulat and Akame. Even though Tatsumi's Teigu was strong, that didn't necessarily mean Tatsumi's base strength was all that. Remove his Teigu and how far did he think he would be able to get in this world? With Tatsumi's current skill level, all he really had was some good sword skills and pure strength. He wouldn't get far in this world if that were the case. Hence why Bulat brought up the idea of them going to the mountains for a while in order to continue their training. Up there they would have arguably the best sort of training possible. Although they encountered danger beasts up there, they didn't back down from the fight whatsoever. Instead, they charged forward and began to take down the monsters one by one. All throughout this time, Tatsumi began to consume some of the monsters and even went on to build a bond with Bulat. Romance, you could say. By the time they made it back down the mountain and made their way back to the hideout, Najanda had some very grave news for them. The Prime Minister, he wanted each and every one of his political enemies to be killed from now on. Tatsumi would have ended up finding out that this wasn't the end of the bad news. You see, what ended up happening is that Esdeath had apparently ended up coming back to the capital early. She managed to complete her campaign against the northern tribes at a much faster rate than expected. The agenda would also inform them of the fact she had ended up losing contact with the night raid away team. Everyone would begin to fear the possibility that they were being wiped out. Tatsumi and Bulat wouldn't have much time to process this information before an agenda would end up assigning the two a mission. This mission being to protect one of the Prime Minister's political enemies. They would board the cruise ship and Bulat would use Incursio's stealth ability to scout out the area. This would be in order to seek out any potential threats. Tatsumi and Bulat, while on the cruise ship, they would use this as time to actually bond as well. They would talk about each other's pasts and they would basically be reflecting on how they ended up getting into Night Raid. Bulat's stealth ability would run out though. He would be forced to retreat back into the interior of the ship not too long afterwards. Tatsumi's symbiote sense would actually go off. Yes, that is actually a thing. Symbiote sense. He would end up noticing that many people on the ship, they just seemingly began to fall asleep for some reason. He would be confused at first until he realized that he was getting weak himself. His concentration would be a bit unfocused now. It would be a bit weak. His mental strength was beginning to slip as well, like he was going in and out of consciousness. But he would end up realizing that a strange sound was being played. A person playing a flute would appear. Venom would understand what was happening with his host and he would take over at this moment, having a much more malicious fighting style than Tatsumi ever had. The man with a large double-edged axe would actually attempt to attack Tatsumi, but Venom, he would also end up grabbing the man's body. They would be surprised seeing this. Weren't they supposed to be knocked out by now? It didn't make much sense to them. Like, how is this possible? How are they still moving, especially at this speed? Tatsumi would end up being picked up by Venom. Venom would begin to walk over to the man and they would end up crushing their body right after they had catched them in their grasp. Venom would both consume the man's body and store his Taegu inside of this sludge-like body. Bulat would arrive later on, only to see that Tatsumi, who was completely consumed by Venom at this moment, was attempting to hold their own against the rest of the three beasts. The flute player of the group, they would be the one Bulat witnessed being fought by Tatsumi. They had the ability to manipulate the emotions of characters with their Taegu, making them a very frustrating opponent for Tatsumi. It messed with his concentration to a pretty great amount. And Venom, of course, would also be affected. They would notice the change in Tatsumi's emotions over this time, and this would actually disrupt their symbiosis to an extent. Venom would be acting in correspondence with Tatsumi's emotions, but at the same time, due to this frustrating nature and this constantly shifting amount, it was hard to adjust. Bulat would knock out the Taegu user though, in order to help Tatsumi. They would slay them right afterward. Bulat would request to fight Liver by himself though, due to the older man being his former superior within the capital. He remembered working with the man after all. Tatsumi would begrudgingly accept Bulat's request here. Tatsumi was aware of the fact that Bulat was strong after all. He figured that Bulat would be able to handle himself here. Although Liver was strong, Bulat had youth on his side. With Incratio, Bulat was also stronger than Liver. Liver's control of liquids was rather strong though. He did have the chance to actually damage Incratio thanks to his Tegu's abilities. It was a pretty, how should I say it? It was a pretty close match, you could say, but Bulat would manage to land a killing blow in the end on Liver. Tatsumi would take the man's Tegu and store it inside the Venom as well. The same would be done for the flute Tegu. Bulat would be weakened after that fight, but he would still be better off here due to the fact that he wasn't being distracted by the flute playing, and Liver wasn't able to use this to his advantage. He wasn't able to end up using his poison in order to also mess with Bulat. Tatsumi would have ended up finding this to be a bit of a small victory. The reasoning for this being was, well, Bulat did not necessarily die here. Neither one of them ended up dying. So this was a win on Night Raid's side this time around. He would still have the desire to get stronger though. He would have realized that there were probably going to be even stronger opponents from here on out, especially with the likes of Esdeath being back in the capital now. He would train with Lubak and Bulat more often. Mine would even find Tatsumi and Lubak in the middle of doing push-ups with Akame and Leone sitting on their backs respectively. Bulat would be in the middle of practicing to extend his time in stealth mode. The agenda would arrive to inform everyone of the fact that she would actually be leaving for the Revolutionary Army HQ in order to hand over the Tegu Tatsumi collected during their time on the cruise ship. They were able to gather 3 Tegus with no deaths. That was a major win on the Revolutionary Army side. She would leave Akame in charge from here on out. Tatsumi would make his way to the capital hideout, operated by Lubak, who disguised it as a bookstore afterward. The two would end up making their way down to the secret room, only to find that Leone was there too, except for the fact that, well, she was drunk as well. Lubak would just sigh in annoyance and then turn over to Tatsumi, who would end up informing Tatsumi of this whole issue with Mind's face being added to the wanted posters. With this now being the case, Lubak, Tatsumi, and Bulat, they would be the only ones capable of walking through the capital from here on out. And in the case of Lubak, it was so long. Wait a second. And in the case of Bulat, it was so long as he did not use his Tegu. Lubak would also inform Tatsumi about this new police force. They were called the Jaegers. Their leader's name was Esdeath. This disturbed Tatsumi. Tatsumi would find out more about Esdeath's vicious nature and realize that the woman only seemed to want more rebellion to happen so that she could feed her bloodlust. Venom would show a bit of interest in this strange character, knowing how strong she was and her tendencies as well. Tatsumi would be intimidated by the woman though. His ears would perk up though when Lubak also talked about there being a sort of tournament with a huge cash prize to the victor of the battle. Tatsumi, realizing that he could end up competing in this competition, this tournament, and if he were to win this tournament, he could actually use the cash prize in order to send it back to his village. He would immediately want to know more. Lubak would continue to explain, and Tatsumi would just conjure up a whole new identity from there on out. Esdeath would be the one overseeing the tournament personally. The purpose of this tournament was to see who would be the next user of the Taegu Esdeath. I probably mispronounced that. I apologize in advance. Tatsumi, he would enter under the guise of a blacksmith from the countryside. Venom would be enhancing his strength and senses all throughout his battles, meaning that the competition wouldn't really be all that challenging overall. Tatsumi would end up winning the tournament with minimal difficulty, but there would be an unexpected side effect. He would have ended up winning Esdeath's affection at that moment as well. In her eyes, he matched all the qualities she was looking for in a man. Great skill, confidence, and no fear whatsoever. She would place a collar around his neck to the surprise of everyone. Everyone was originally thinking that she was going to just come down and give him his cash prize, but no. She decided to put a collar around his neck with a chain around it too. Tatsumi would begin to break the collar though in response. Esdeath would notice this and quickly knock him out. Venom would have done something about this, but they realized how bad of a sort of situation they were in right now. Venom found that it would be bad to attempt to fight back here, knowing what this woman was capable of, and the many other unknowns here. On top of that, Venom would rather keep his host's identity a secret to the public as well, so he could continue going in and out to the capital. Tatsumi would end up waking up, finding himself still chained but with the Empire now. He would be surrounded by the Jaegers, and Esdeath was holding on to his chain. She would have been explaining to the Jaegers the meaning of the chain. And this chain was basically meant to declare that Tatsumi was her lover. Tatsumi would hear this and immediately break his collar though. He would state that he had no intention of joining the Empire. And Esdeath, hearing this, would simply shrug it off. And she would end up replying that he would become obedient in due time. He was basically going through his rebellious phase, but soon enough he would learn to be obedient to her specifically. He would know subservience. He would understand what sort of life he would live from here on out. Tatsumi would begin to get aggravated, but he was in the presence of Esdeath and the Jaegers. He would attempt to calm down, knowing that he probably wouldn't be able to fight them all off here. He would probably lose. He was confident in his abilities, but he wasn't dumb either, not extremely dumb. He was aware of the fact that even though he was strong, Esdeath was most likely stronger. That did not necessarily mean he would not be thinking of escape plans throughout his time here. The first time would be when the Jaegers attacked a bandit camp. He and Esdeath, they would be watching from a cliff. He would have originally been thinking of a way to escape, but all thoughts would end up being taken out when Esdeath would reach out and grab his hand. He would realize that she had an insane grip, and Esdeath would have Tatsumi end up staying within her quarters as well. Tatsumi would try to convince her that, hey, maybe the Revolutionary Army isn't so bad as they make it out to be. I mean, look at how bad the capital is. And Esdeath would realize what Tatsumi was trying to do at this moment. She would end up arguing with Tatsumi, stating that she would be the one to change him, not the other way around. She would have ended up standing her ground all throughout this sort of debate, this sort of topic. And he would realize that it was fruitless to really try and convince her right now. She would end up using Tatsumi as a body pillow right afterwards, so Tatsumi would have frozen up at that moment. And he would have been scared. This was the first time he had known real and true fear. He would not be able to sleep all throughout the night. It was a pretty horrible night for him because of that. The next day, Tatsumi and the Jaegers would be led to Mount Fake, giving the brown-haired boy some nostalgia. He would be thinking about his experience with Bulat during this time. It was really refreshing. He appreciated Bulat for taking him out to train over there. They were able to catch up on so much, especially after Shell's death. It had basically been eating him up for so long, and now he was finally back at this place. He wondered what they were going to be doing here, and it turns out that they would actually be hunting danger beasts, just like how it was when he was with Bulat. Tatsumi and Wave would be the ones working together during this time. The two would end up encountering several tree beasts. Tatsumi would realize this was his perfect opportunity to escape the scene. He would use the confusion of battle to make his escape. Venom would envelop Tatsumi, concealing his identity once more, and they would make their escape from there on out. Wave would begin to freak out when he realized that he had seemingly lost Esdeath's boy toy. He would fear what sort of consequences he would have from Esdeath, and he would quickly go searching for him. He would try and scout for Tatsumi. He would activate his Grand Chariot armor Grand Chariot armor / Tegu in order to search for Tatsumi. Tatsumi would still be in the forest during this time. He would still be along the mountain range, but thanks to the fact that he was covered up by Venom, Wave would not be able to recognize Tatsumi. And it was sort of the same for Tatsumi as well, in where he wouldn't be able to recognize Wave thanks to the fact that he was also covered in his own sort of suit, although his was less living, you could say. The two would encounter each other, and they would end up immediately getting into fighting positions. Wave would recognize Venom from the rumors about there being another member of Night Raid who had an unusual Tegu. The rumors stated that it moved like liquid, it was stronger than steel, and at the same time, like it held several abilities. It was black as the night as well. Tatsumi would only focus on escaping, but Wave, they would be relentless in trying to provoke the member of Night Raid into a fight. They were originally thinking that Tatsumi was going to fight as well when they got into fighting positions, but it turned out that Tatsumi was just calling a bluff at that moment, immediately turning his heels around and making a run for it. They would try and taunt Night Raid all throughout this time, and this would all be trying to provoke Tatsumi, trying to get him into a reckless sort of fashion. He would even try and attack Tatsumi as well. But this was when he would realize that he had made a big mistake in trying to fight Tatsumi. due to the fact that Tatsumi held a massive strength and speed advantage against him. Tatsumi would end up punching Tatsumi would end up basically doing this. Tatsumi would end up punching Wave in the chest, in his chest plate, and Venom's strength would end up cracking Wave's armor. Wave would end up being surprised, and not only that, but he would have ended up being flung away by Venom. Wave would be extremely surprised and groan in pain from Venom's attack. They would have ended up crashing into a tree. Wave would have been almost halfway unconscious. He would have looked down and realized how this armor was cracked. The armor was quite durable though. He was surprised at the fact that this guy was able to actually bring damage towards it. It really made no sense to him. The only one that should be able to really be able to make any sort of dent in Grand Chariot would obviously be Esdeath. But no, this guy, he was able to also be able to actually dent it, be able to actually make it crack. It was in a pretty bad sort of situation. He was barely even able to move after that one punch from Tatsumi, and that one backhand from Venom as well. His helmet was cracked as well. It just continued to surprise Wave, and he had to really reflect on what he had just witnessed firsthand. Tatsumi would encounter a danger beast as well during his time running back to Night Raid, and he would be quick to kill it. Venom would consume the danger beast's brain afterward. Kame would end up just watching before walking up, tapping the boy's shoulder, started telling Tatsumi a bit. Kame wouldn't have even been fazed by Venom eating some brains at this point either. They had gone through quite a bit themselves, so of course she wouldn't necessarily even think much about what they had just witnessed from the symbiote. Kame would end up escorting Tatsumi back to the base, although they wouldn't realize somebody was also following them. Tatsumi would report the situation to Agenda and the rest of Night Raid. The Jaegers, they had matched them skill for skill. They were a strong group of individuals. Esdeath was the one they especially had to be careful about. He was unable to actually see her, fight at all, but he realized that she had an intimidating presence. She was able to knock him out in just one blow back at the tournament as well. So they had to be especially careful around her. He was wary of her strength. Dr. Stylish, though, he would have ended up being the one to follow the group back to their base. He would have sent out his own personal army to attack the hideout. Tatsumi and Bulat, they would be the greatest heavy hitters against Dr. Stylish's army. Tatsumi, they would kill Kaku when he ended up seeing them with Shell's original Tegu. Once he saw them, an immediate rage ended up filling Tatsumi. He ended up going completely berserk against Kaku, not even really giving them much of a chance to defend himself. But after killing Kaku and eating their brain, he would successfully retrieve her Tegu afterward. A poisonous gas would be released though, right after, rendering most of Night Raid immobile, with the exceptions of Tatsumi and Bulat. Susanoo Nagenda's Tegu would also arrive in order to help out in the fight against Dr. Stylish's army. Stylish would realize what sort of situation he was in when he realized that these guys were actually able to drive back his army, he would end up being forced to take drastic measures and inject himself with a special serum. This serum would basically turn himself into a danger beast himself. Tatsumi and Bulat, they would make their way to the newly formed danger beast, striking at the man-turned-beast. Susanoo would help Akame by bringing her to the top of the danger beast's head. Tatsumi would rip through the limbs of the danger beast, and Akame, she would stamp through their head. Stylish would die right there and then. From there, they'd be forced to relocate to a new area within the capital, this one being filled with danger beasts. But this would be required in order to keep a low cover. Tatsumi would join Leone in danger beast hunting, using them as fuel for Venom, further dampening the symbiote. They would be consuming the brains and the rest of the bodies of each and every danger beast. They'd receive reports of there being new types of danger beasts, so all of a sudden, this would pique Tatsumi's curiosity. After what he dealt with when it came on to Dr. Stylish's army, he wanted to kill as many danger beasts as possible. He wanted to do this in order to make this world hopefully more peaceful. After all, he had gone through so much up until now, and he didn't want to have it be that others had to suffer the same sort of tragedies that he had to go through, all because of these danger beasts and the capital's corrupt system. While patrolling one day, Tatsumi and Lubak, they would end up finding that it would probably be a better idea to survey the area from the top of a nearby mountain. They would climb up to the top and start looking from there, only to end up getting attacked by Esdeath right at that moment. She would pursue the two until she found, Tatsumi. She would immediately halt her pursuit against the two, and end up actually killing the army that was with her as well. This army of new danger beasts, at least that's what many of them originally thought. It turned out that these guys were actually created by Dr. Stylish prior to his death by the hands of Night Raid. She would make quick work of the danger beasts and be overjoyed seeing her lover again, Tatsumi. Tatsumi and Esdeath would end up getting attacked by a hooded figure though. This hooded figure would teleport them to another island using their Tegu. Tatsumi would at first think that this was maybe an illusion. Esdeath would deny this though, and she would be quick to disprove his theory by walking over to him, grabbing his face, pulling him in, and then kissing him. This would cause Tatsumi to blush for a second, but this would also end up disproving his theory as well. So this had to mean that they were really just teleported just now to a whole new location. They wouldn't be able to focus on that for long before they ended up getting attacked by two danger beasts respectively. Tatsumi would use Venom's webs in order to make quick work of the creatures by dragging them down to the ground, lifting them up, and then crashing them into each other. Esdeath would deal the final blow on the monsters by creating ice weapons piercing through their bodies. Esdeath would look around the area and deduce that they were on an island of some sort, southeast of the capital. Tatsumi would be impressed by her ability to figure out where exactly they were. Although, it wasn't necessarily the exact coordinates. The fact that she was able to deduce that they were on an island southeast of the capital, that was impressive in Tatsumi's book. the two would see no point in even panicking at this point either. And they would rather focus their energy on finding a way back. During this time, the two would end up beginning to bond. They would talk about their pasts, and during this time, Tatsumi would realize even more how pointless it was to even bother trying to recruit the woman at this point. She was incredibly sadistic. It wasn't even to like a controlled manner, to a controlled manner either. No, this was completely within her nature. This was completely within her nature. The way that she had grown up, all of this made so much more sense to Tatsumi now, and that he had to get rid of her soon. She was an incredibly strong individual. She worked for the capital. She worked for the empire. He needed to get rid of her because she was going to be like the biggest thorn within the Revolutionary Army's agenda. While doing this, they would end up also finding out that, hey, maybe it would be a good idea to maybe use a danger beast. Esdeath would end up being the one to end up mentioning this idea, and the idea being to use one of the flying danger beasts, or maybe just one that can swim really well, in order to make their way back to the capital. She would end up going to find the danger beast, but while doing that, the portal would end up opening up. Tatsumi would holler over to Esdeath, informing her the fact that there was a portal that just opened up. He would also make his way halfway through. Esdeath would drop her plans immediately and follow along. Tatsumi would state that the next time they meet, they would end up having to be enemies once more. Esdeath would understand and be a bit disappointed, but they would step through the portal as well. And she understood that they were on two separate sides, and they basically wouldn't have to end up always being in conflict because of the fact that neither one would refuse to switch sides. Esdeath would end up seeing Tatsumi go invisible thanks to Venom's camouflage ability. Tatsumi would regroup with the rest of Night Raid afterward, when he managed to actually, lose track of Esdeath. Once Tatsumi ended up regrouping with Night Raid, an agenda would inform everyone of the fact that they had a new mission. This mission would be to kill Bolik, a key member of a religious group by the name of Path of Peace. They would spread misinformation regarding themselves, going in two different directions in order to confuse the Jaegers. The Jaegers would end up making a mistake of splitting up. Bulls, Karome, and Wave, they would end up being in the group that Night Raid would ambush. Bulat would make quick work of Wave, sending him away from the battlefield. Karome would end up using their dolls in order to fight the rest of Night Raid. Tatsumi would barrage the puppets with his own set of attacks though, being barbaric in nature, although Tatsumi would still have a mix of his own sort of skill in turning their arms into blades to cut the corpse dolls down. He wasn't able to get like all of them though. He managed to get a good amount though. Tatsumi would end up defeating 8-Man. He would focus his attention on fighting Natala right afterwards, but there would be several interruptions stopping the fight from continuing. Karome would retreat after a self-destruct explosion would be let off from Boris Rubicante. They would manage to escape with about 5 of their dolls still intact. Raid, the newest recruit of Night Raid, Chelsea. they would have been the one to end up landing the killing blow to Bowles. Tatsumi would regroup with the rest of Night Raid afterwards and find out that Chelsea left to deal with Karome on her own, alarming the brown-haired boy. He would chase after Chelsea, following a trail, and by the time he made it into the city, he would realize that he was too late. Her head would have been found to be at the top of a pole in the middle of the town. Tatsumi would feel defeated after that. He had failed to save another one of his teammates. Tatsumi had felt so defeated after seeing Chelsea's death. He couldn't even save her. She was literally the newest recruit, and he wasn't able to save her. How messed up was that? Night Raid would arrive in Kaio. I don't even know how to pronounce this word, but Night Raid would arrive in Kaio after that mess, and they would survey the area. They would know to be more cautious here. They would stake out the area. Mine and Tatsumi, they would go on a mission together, only to get attacked by Suryu of the Jaegers and a member of the Rakasha demons. Tatsumi's symbiote sense would go off once again. This would allow him to avoid Suryu's attack. Mine would request to fight Suryu on her own when she realized that this was the same girl who killed Shell. Tatsumi would oblige. He would end up dealing with Ibara of the Rakasha demons. He would take his fight over to a nearby ruin, and find that his opponent was quite nimble, knowingly so. He would use Venom's webs in order to bring down the entire ruin on his assailant though, which would effectively take them out of commission. He would stomp their head out afterwards, before rushing back to accompany Mine in case she was in trouble. He would save her from Suryu's self-destruction bomb right then and there. He was glad to be able to make it in time to save her, commenting on how he was too late to save Chelsea, and how he wasn't there to save Shell either, but he was glad that he was able to make it right in time in order to save Mine. Night Raid would be forced to rest after these events though. This did not necessarily mean they weren't doing anything though. They would be planning in order to make their way into the capital during this period of time. They would end up splitting into two teams. Akame, Mine, Lubak, and Bulat would be on one team, while the other would be composed of Najender, Tatsumi, Susanoo, and Leone. Akame's group had been tasked with striking from behind. In terms of Najenda and her group though, they would be the ones to serve as a distraction towards Esdeath and her group, the Jaegers. The distraction group, they were meant to be the ones to find Esdeath, Karome, and Bolak. They managed to accomplish that in time, but when it came on to the other team, Akame's group, for some reason, they had yet to arrive. This wasn't going according to plan. Tatsumi would be forced to access Venom's camouflage ability in order to sneak his way over to Bolak. He was hoping to be the one to actually finish the man off. When it came on to the rest of the group though, they would be the ones to actually begin to fight Esdeath, knowing that she was the strongest one to worry about. Esdeath, unfortunately, was too strong for Night Raid. Esdeath would make quick work of Night Raid and begin to harm Leone. She would harm the lioness to an extreme degree. Tatsumi was able to hear his screams from basically a mile away. It irritated him. He knew that what Esdeath was doing was wrong. He knew that what she was doing was probably going to end up ending the life of Leone if he did not decide to actually step in. But at the same time, they had a mission. What was he supposed to do? He tried to block out the noise and focus on the specific goal of just taking down Bolik, but he just wasn't able to take it though. He wasn't able to just block out the noise. Every time he tried to block out the noise, it just seemed to become louder. His heart rate began to increase at the same time as well. His stress levels were going up. He was getting more and more frustrated, more irritated. Eventually, he just couldn't take it anymore, and he decided to make a run for it. He tried to do a sneak attack against Esdeath, but she was able to sense him. She was able to sense his presence. So she was able to block his sneak attack by creating a large wall of ice. This attack, though, it would end up not going as well as she imagined. You see, what ended up happening is that although it was able to block Tatsumi's attack, the ice wall began to crack though, which surprised Esdeath. Most of the time, nobody had the physical strength to actually be able to crack any of her ice walls. This would impress her. Even when it shattered, that impressed her even more. That rarely ever happened. Maybe when you were using the Taegu, but when it came on to Taegus as well, like, it's still a rarity. When it came on to Najenda, she would try and use Susanoo's trump card. This would end up enhancing the speed and strength of the living Taegu, so that it could accomplish the goal of killing Bolik. Esdeath would use her own trump card in response though, which would end up freezing time. She would walk over to Susanoo casually and create an ice sword. This would be what she used to chop them down into several pieces. Time would resume afterward, and Esdeath would also be walking over to Venom. Najenda would have seen what ended up happening to Susanoo and be distraught. And she was wondering just what Esdeath was going to do to Tatsumi, especially now that he was out of his camouflage mode. Esdeath would be able to recognize the presence, even though they were invisible before. But now she was wondering what he was going to end up going through when it came on to Esdeath. Esdeath seemed to be a very sadistic kind of person. Najenda only hoped that she would end up going easy on Tatsumi, knowing that she seemingly had a soft spot for the boy for some reason. The other team would arrive at this moment though. At this moment, they would end up being the ones to accomplish the goal of killing Bolik. With the mission complete, Night Raid would end up heading out. Tatsumi would pounce on Esdeath, surprising her. And with the added weight, this would end up forcing Esdeath down to the ground. He would rub down her arms and legs, making sure that she wouldn't be able to just simply cut through not the ice, but the webs. Make sure that she wouldn't be able to just create some sort of ice weapon. Who knows, an ice blade, an ice sword, whatever sort of sharp item that she could create within a moment's notice in order to get her out of her bindings. He made sure to restrict her wrists and ankles so that she wouldn't be able to move like that. At least, he was hoping that this would be able to last for a good amount of time so that Night Raid would be able to escape. With the mission complete, Night Raid would of course head out. and Night Raid would actually take a less direct route to their base in order to fool their pursuers. Everyone would be healing from the last mission afterward. Knowing how tough Esdeath was, this was a learning experience for everyone, never to underestimate the strength of the Ice Queen. Mine and Tatsumi, they would be sent off to collect food for the group. And here, this was when Mine would actually confess her feelings with Tatsumi. This would surprise the brown-haired boy, knowing just how monstrous he was when it came on to using Venom. He never thought any girl would be attracted to him after seeing him eat somebody's brains. She would go on to even state that she had gotten used to the more cannibalistic ways, since she would usually detach Tatsumi from those actions. She would use it as simply saying that whenever he was using his Taegu, that just is how it is. It's sort of the Taegu's mechanism. It's not what Tatsumi is into, but it's just how the Taegu seems to work. Or for those unfamiliar with the term Taegu, Imperial Arms. So it no longer disturbed her, she just usually detached Tatsumi from those sort of actions. And to even prove what she was saying was true, she would end up walking close to Tatsumi, grabbing his face and pulling him in for a kiss. This kiss would seal the deal. The two would declare their love for each other to the rest of Night Raid afterward. They would also receive a new mission, with this involving infiltrating the palace. Tatsumi and Lubak would be the ones to head out, meeting with a member of the resistance in order to help with their mission. Unfortunately, they would find themselves walking into a trap set up by Sierra prior to their arrival. Sierra being the Prime Minister's son, the one to have actually teleported Esdeath and Tatsumi beforehand. Tatsumi would find himself fighting a losing battle against the high-ranking General Budo, who had a Taegu that produced electricity. This was probably the worst sort of match Tatsumi had ended up finding himself in yet, because of the fact that the heat produced from the electricity was making the fight even worse with Tatsumi and Venom. Tatsumi would be defeated and be forced to watch Lubak die right before his very eyes. He knew that he was weak to heat and what else? To heat and sonic vibrations or sonic waves, but he never expected to be defeated this easily from one of them. He was expecting that he would probably be limited in this moveset, but never to the point where he would basically be so weak that he could barely even fight. And now, because of his weakness, he would have to see the death of one of his friends, one of his closest friends that he made throughout this time in Night Raid. Seeing the death of Lubag ended up just causing a rage within Tatsumi's heart. This rage would boil over too. Budo would knock out Tatsumi afterward with an unadulterated rage, just constantly boiling over in Tatsumi. Every single moment, it would just be, every single time, it would simply be Tatsumi just looking over what he could have done better, how he could have approached the situation better, and how he could have ended up saving Lubak if only he wasn't so stupid in the way that he fought Budo. Just maybe they could have had a chance. Maybe he wouldn't have to see Lubak die. Maybe he wouldn't have to see General Budo just stab his friend right through the heart. Just just maybe, it would be pity. It would be a woe is me sort of moment. It would be him basically screaming at himself, telling himself that he could have done better each and every time, and every time he would also be looking at what Budo did to his friend. He wanted to kill Budo the most right now, because in his eyes it would be an eye for an eye, a life for a life. That's the only way this would ever be fair. When Tatsumi woke up, he would realize that the capital had set up a public execution for him in order to lower the morale of. This is where we begin to diverge from the original timeline. In this version of events, what would end up happening is that Tatsumi, now freed from his captors, would actually go on to defend himself against the Jaegers that were in the vicinity at the moment. Akame would have been busy dealing with her sister, her youngest sister, Karome, and she would request to deal with this person alone rather than have Tatsumi intervene. Tatsumi would end up actually, understanding where she was coming from. He would oblige to her requests and make sure that the match would not be interfered with. In order to make sure this didn't happen though, Tatsumi would actually go after Wave. Wave would have been the one to actually try and get in the middle of the fight. Tatsumi would not allow that to happen though. He would try to keep Wave down for as long as possible, but he would have to admit that Wave, especially with his Tegu, or Imperial Arm, was rather strong, very strong actually. Not enough to the point where he could downright overwhelm him in a fight though. What Tatsumi would end up doing though was, in order to finish off this annoyance, in order to deal with this annoyance, he would end up stabbing through Wave's heart. He would have managed to penetrate through Wave's armor and actually hit his heart. He would have stabbed right through the heart, which would have ended Wave's life right then and there. He didn't necessarily want to do this. He wasn't all that interested in killing people, but at the end of the day, it was sometimes necessary. He had been in this business for a good while now, so his aversion to killing, it had been dampened over these past couple of months. He was not all that worried when it came on to killing people any longer. He was a wanted criminal after all, and he was literally about to be executed right beforehand, so this did not really faze him at all. What was really important now is to take down the rest of the Empire. Anybody that would get in their way. He wasn't playing nice at all today. He acknowledged the fact that him being overly cautious was what ended up causing some of the deaths before. The fact that he wasn't all that knowledgeable about how to use, his Tegu, or, Venom. The fact that he was so dumb back then. But now he had to understand that there were more lives at stake right now. They were so close to their goal that they could not afford to be wasting time. If it meant that he had to play dirty, then fair enough. That's what his mentality was at this moment. He thought he had this mentality before, but he realized that he was going kinda easy on some of his enemies, although he really should not have. They weren't expecting for this to happen. They had honestly thought that this was just a legend at best, just a myth, something that many people would spread, that the royal family spread throughout the years, throughout the centuries, in order to bring fear to the people, let them know that they had all the power in the world, and just a moment's notice they could activate it. They thought they were bluffing for the longest while, but apparently not. They had to break through this guy's defenses as well. This would be the job of Bulat and Tatsumi. They would end up working together, finding a weak spot, or more so creating one. And they would continue to abuse this weak spot until they actually penetrated through the armor. They would make their way up to the young emperor and take him down from there. Or at least that was the plan anyways. What ended up happening was there was another issue at hand. This issue being the fact that the Tegu, this giant mech, was actually beginning to collapse on itself. When they actually looked outside from the hole that they had managed to make, Tatsumi would realize that it was about to crush many innocent civilians. Tatsumi did not have a cold heart at all. He still had a soft heart. He had a soft spot for people at the end of the day. And so he refused to let them die. He would tell Bulat to handle the emperor. He would make sure to avoid having these poor people crushed. He would use his webs in order to create a sort of, net for the mech that was literally about to fall down. It would manage to hold it for a little while, but it wasn't going to hold the thing for very long. Tatsumi would do his best in order to use his strength and keep up the, mech for as long as possible. It was heavy, yes, but he was using all of his willpower. He could feel his body beginning to get tired from holding this thing for so long. It felt as if his body was about to give up, but at this moment he would realize that the people, they were already gone now. The people they had managed to escape from the Tegu, the giant Tegu. Tatsumi, he would be relieved, and he would let go of the Tegu, pushing it to the other side. It would crash into a couple of buildings, but he was positive that there were no people in any of those buildings right then and there. He would sigh in exhaustion, but he still had one more threat to deal with. This, of course, being Esdeath. Bulat, he would have already dealt with the Emperor and Honest. Honest was trying to hide, of course, though. But Bulat would have ended up finding him in the end. The Emperor, not the Emperor, but Honest, he would try to shoot at Bulat, but it was ineffective against his armor. When it came on to the Emperor as well, sure, he had the Imperial Guards with him as well, but they weren't much of a challenge for Bulat at this point. The last real enemy that, Night Raid had to deal with would be, of course, Esdeath, the Ice Queen herself. She would have made her way down a couple of moments later and see the situation at hand. She would have freaked out considering all that had just happened. Well, freaked out isn't necessarily the proper word for what she was doing right now. Rather, she was surprised. She wasn't expecting for Night Raid to have managed to get this far. But she would look over to Tatsumi and mention that If he wanted to live, it would be best that he can just be with her from now on. He had already proven that he was strong enough, that he was worthy of her presence. But Tatsumi, he wasn't interested in joining Esdeath. He had gotten so far. He was with Night Raid for the thick and thin, and he wasn't about to just give up all of their progress, and just because he felt like he had a better chance at survival if he were to stick with Esdeath, basically betraying his whole family of the sorts. A Night Raid had basically become a family for him, and of course with all of these stats that had happened, it had pained him each and every time, and it was all because of the Jaegers, all because of Esdeath's group. Tatsumi, he wasn't having any of this. No, rather, he would look at Esdeath and he would charge forward. Esdeath was quick on her feet though. She would dodge most of Tatsumi's attacks. Tatsumi was exhausted, but he would have felt a great amount of anger here, a great amount of sorrow. Regret was mixed in there as well. But when it came on to Esdeath, she was just a battle maniac of the sorts. The only issue was the fact that there were more than just one Night Raid member there trying to fight off Esdeath. It would have almost seemingly been like a remake of the last encounter. This time though, they were more prepared for Esdeath. What ended up happening is that Akame, she would focus on sneak attacks. Bulat, he would have just been coming out of the cockpit. Not the cockpit, but out of the Empire, the broken Tegu. Leone, she would have had her Tegu active, having the strength of a lion active at this moment. Mine, she was always... It was basically like this when it came on to Mine. Her Tegu would have realized the danger that Esdeath held, and at this moment it would probably be at its most powerful because of what Esdeath could do. They would all go in charging at Esdeath, and Esdeath, she would end up getting overwhelmed in the end. She would have tried to block off most of their attacks, but in the end, they would have won. Now, bro, what am I saying now for me? Tatsumi's group, they would have ended up winning in the end. What ended up happening is that, well, Esdeath, she would have tried to block off an attack from Kame's katana, understanding there was a poisonous factor to it, but she wasn't expecting for Tatsumi to be the one to deliver the final blow to her, this being a punch to the head with so much force behind it that it would actually knock her head off. This would surprise the whole group, but Tatsumi, he would have been breathing in exhaustion. His symbiote suit would come off right after, and he would be struggling to breathe, mainly because of just the amount that he had drained from himself. Venom was working off of adrenaline right now. Tatsumi was incredibly exhausted from trying to hold up that, well, incredibly large Tegu for a good while. But now, he also fought off Esdeath until the very end and managed to kill her too. He felt victorious, but at the same time, he needed to get some rest, some chocolate, lots and lots of chocolate actually, and he would actually look back and see Esdeath's head. He would do this one thing and one thing only. Tatsumi, while in the Venom state, while enveloped in Venom, he would walk over and grab Esdeath's head and, well, consume it right after. Night Raid would look on in a bit of shock, but at the same time, they had gotten kind of used to it as well, considering how he would used to do that on many of their missions, mentioning how his Taegu kind of needed it for some reason. They had never really heard of a Taegu like this, but there were always strange Taegus out there, and in the end, they would be able to set up a new sort of empire from there. This empire being ran on the whole issue of, democracy. It wouldn't have been necessarily the same way as it would be in canon, due to the fact that there were some crucial figures that were no longer here, such as Wave and Run. Instead, there would be more people in their place, such as Mine and Bulat. They would have been the ones to help with the management of this new empire. It would have been more equal, at least hopefully. The one thing that wasn't necessarily all that equal about this one would be the whole issue of Tatsumi and his Imperial arms. Essentially, what ended up happening is that, Venom, even with all of these things solved, he still needed some form of food. It was either chocolate or brains. And so, the people would have a yearly tax. Not necessarily yearly, but more so monthly tax. That being chocolate. And of course, when it came on to the corpses as well, they would end up dissecting some of them in order to give Venom the brains of the deceased people. It would be a bit weird, something that the people would have to get used to, but overall, most people, they wouldn't be complaining, considering there was far more equal opportunities here. You didn't have to be part of a noble family in order to get a high successful job in life. You weren't stuck to being poor for pretty much your whole life just because you didn't have connections like that, just because you weren't born into a rich family, or you didn't join the government. But yeah, that's basically how we end the story. Hopefully this is different enough for you guys. And so yeah, it's your boy Kintai Next signing out. You guys know the deal. So peace.